Well, nobody's really talked very much about the accumulation of capital, which surprised me because it seems to be.
That would be nice.
Excuse me?
If you could introduce, if you could.
I'm Tom Michael. I teach at Colgate University, and I went to the new school, so it's good to be back. I would like to direct some of the discussion towards the question of investment. I think the picture we're getting here is a very, very good one. We definitely are in an era of rising surplus value in Marxian terms, with stagnant wages and rising productivity. But I agree with Peter and Duncan's point that it hasn't expressed itself, I think surprisingly, in a growing profit share. It has mainly expressed itself in the growth of the incomes of the top groups, the CEOs and others. And it is also, leads me to ask the question of how it is affected in the accumulation process, to have this, tremendous redistribution of income, but not going towards a form that would stimulate investment spending. And I've looked at the investment share data in the U.S., and it's very clear that the neoliberal era is basically characterized by a very low investment share, despite this very favorable shift in the distribution toward capital. And in fact, in the immediate period preceding the crisis, it's very, very low. This is the lowest in the whole post-war period. What was really driving the economy after 2001 was, as we I think all know, was residential investment and this sort of housing boom driven by or fueled by a housing bubble. So I think there's a story here, and I'd like to hear people's ideas about this. So I'll just leave it at that and see what people's response is to the question of the effect of. Oh no, there is actually one more thing I'd bring up, and that is, okay, so if you're redistributing income upwards and increasing the rate of surplus value, it creates the issue of demand, and where's the demand going to come from? If it came from accumulation, well, that would be that would be fine. That would be a sort of a traditional Marxian way of thinking about how a rising rate of surplus value can be accommodated. But as I mentioned, it hasn't taken that form. So the question then arises, where does the demand come from to maintain economic growth? And it seems to me that there's really been a tremendous increase in consumption spending by the very rich. And luxury consumption spending has been a major part of the sort of neoliberal model. This actually comes out very clearly in the 1990s when the stock market boom really did fuel a consumption boom, and it was all concentrated in the very top the top decile of income distribution. So, I guess I'd like to hear some discussion of the accumulation process and how it fits in.
Eileen Grable, University of Denver. I appreciate very much the way that Rick Wolff put the crisis in a Marxian context. I, of course, think he's absolutely right about that. I just want to add to what he said. I suspect he probably wouldn't disagree, that what we're seeing is this crisis developing on a global scale in different ways every day. When I look at what's going on the European periphery, first on the eastern part of the European periphery, and of course in the last week or so on the southern part of the European periphery, what we're seeing is a dynamic wherein the crisis may have been stabilized in its epicenter in the United States at the present time, but with every day we're seeing new outbreaks of financial instability and accumulation crises emerge in different parts of the world. It may be the case that once the European Union is able to get things under control, if they are, in the southern part of the European periphery, we start to see new problems in other countries that have tied their hands, thinking about the developing world, of course. So, of course, this is a crisis which is far more complex than I think capitalists, than neoclassical economists in the United States and Europe have suggested. We haven't, I think, begun to see the end of the crisis and all of the different phases of the crisis. In that context, I'd also note We're starting to see the emergence of pretty serious wage pressures in China, and it's been fascinating to see the discussions just over the last few weeks of rising wage costs in China and what that may mean and is already meaning for capital accumulation in China.
I'm Alex Deroy at the University of Western Scotland. Very pleased to be able to come here and listen to the discussion today. Just two observations. Alex Deroy, University of the West of Scotland. No one's really talked about the role of organised labour when we come to talking about wage and profit shares. I mean, when we talked about the growing wage share in the US up until 1970, you know, we're also talking about increasing organisation and mobilisation of labour to represent its own interests. I mean, yes, trade union density in the US has been declining since the 50s, but I mean, it was a progressive story there. You know, you might say it was, well, accommodating labour to capitalist interests, but whatever. And the second point is, this may sound a bit cynical, but I mean, do the old-fashioned Marxist notions, if I can use that phrase, of wage and profit share, are they increasingly inappropriate to describe modern power relations in a modern capitalist economy? Because we can talk about trends in the share of profit, but of course profit isn't just earned by capitalists. Profit is also earned by people who have access to, what do you call them, pension funds, superannuation funds. So many workers in effect are earning profit, but as a couple of you have highlighted, the wage share is also inappropriate because you made the obvious point that the biggest beneficiaries in the last 30 years have been executive and supervisory employees who, so in that sense, the wage share in itself is disguising capital, but the profit share is also disguising labour. So it's a more complex relationship than it would have been 50 years ago, where profit would easily have been synonymous with the interest of capital. So, yeah, just two observations there for comment.
I'm Alex Isurieta. I work for the United Nations. It's just a question as to if there has been any thinking by yourself or any more data on the process of concentration that results from this crisis, as, for example, compared with other crises in the past. Every crisis leads to further concentration because it is generally the strongest which survive the crisis. And I fear that this crisis has led to a greater concentration. And I think that I was about to take this point, and I think this case is particularly more interesting because it's a concentration in the financial industry. And the problem of that is that it's tended not only the typical contradiction that occurs after a crisis, you know, after the dust has come down between workers and capitalists. Is the most critical aspect of this crisis, I fear, is between the financial industry and the state, in the sense that there is no any kind of room for negotiations. The state is owned by the financial industry by the sheer amount of loans and liquidity that has been given out to the financial industry itself, and the room for improvements in terms of working conditions or standards by the part of any progressive democracy in the world. I'm not referring to the United States, but in general, one would expect that after the crisis there is some kind of action from the state to compensate. But I fear that that's not going to be the case anymore. That in terms of distribution, but also in terms of policy space. I again fear that there is going to be it's going to be much harder after this crisis to allow for the state to, industrial policy, employment generation policies, or anything of the kind, because the financial industry will have a much stronger hold on policy decisions.